And welcome. My name is Hank Clark. I'm program coordinator of the Political Economy Project. And on behalf of the PEP and of our friends and partners in the Department of History, it's a great pleasure to see all of you here today out from the glorious sunshine outside. Just a brief note about our next public event. The PEP's next event is on Thursday in this very room, Rocky 1. May the 1st at 6 p.m., Professor Meir Cohn of the Economics Department will be giving the final installment in his year-long lecture series entitled Understanding the Economy. This one is called Entrepreneurs and Managers, and you're all welcome to attend that one as well. That's at 6 p.m. on May the 1st. But now to today's event. It's a real privilege to have today's speaker with us. Colin Calloway is someone I suspect who needs little introduction to most of you. He's the Kimball Professor of History and Native American Studies here at Dartmouth College, where he has taught for over 30 years. He's the author of many books on the history of early America, and especially of Native America. One of my own personal favorites is The Indian History of an American Institution, Native Americans at Dartmouth, which I think every Dartmouth student should have a look at some point. His scholarship has won numerous awards, including the prestigious Merle Curti Award for Best Book in American Social or Intellectual History, the Billington Prize, and many others. But today, he is here to discuss his fascinating new book, Hard Neighbors, The Scotch-Irish Invasion of Native America. And alas, I have to begin with an apology. We had promised free copies to the first 20 students in attendance, and alas, they have not arrived yet. So I'm going to pass around this notepad, and if you are a student who is currently enrolled at Dartmouth, you're entitled to write your name on the list, and we will get back to you once we have the supply in stock. So thank you for your understanding. But without further ado, won't you please join me in welcoming Colin Calloway.
Thank you, Hank. Maybe you can talk Hank into trading him in for a free toaster or something. Thank you all for being here. Really appreciate your interest, even if I question your judgment. I'm not sure I would have come had I not promised Doug and Hank that I would on a day like this. But it's a pleasure to talk about this book. And I thought I'd start with this, which is a book review that was in the Irish Independent, which I understand is one of the biggest newspapers in Ireland. And there I am with J.D. Vance giving me the side eye. Right? And I knew I was in trouble because I was in one room and I heard my wife in the next room saying, Colin? And that tone of voice sort of always brings me to a halt because it's the tone that's followed by, look what you've done now, you stupid man, right? And this clearly fell into that category. Setting up this idea that I am in opposition to J.D. Vance and everything about him, but putting our views of the Scotch-Irish into juxtaposition. So it's had good reviews so far, but I fully expect other feet to fall because I knew it was a controversial topic when I took it on, and of course it's become more controversial now. And I worried about it since I started doing it because it's the hardest book that I've ever done. Partly because of COVID, partly because of other things in my life, and largely because I didn't know what I was doing. Because I write books because I like books, but I also think why isn't there a book on that? I'd like to have a book on that. Okay, I'll write that book. And that's how I came to the Scotch-Irish. I knew there was a story there, but I wasn't sure what that story would be. And as I got into it, I realized that it was a story with very fuzzy edges. Who were these people? What were they doing? And what was I really trying to get at? And part of the reason I wanted to do it was because in my field, Native American history, most of my colleagues around the country refer to settler colonists, which is a very broad definition, in the early period as English, you know, or sometimes white, but often just English, right? Well, in lots of cases on the early American frontier, the people we're actually talking about are German, Scots, Irish, Scotch-Irish. In fact, the only thing that they have in common is not being English, right? So that's a little clunky, and I wanted to get at that. And the Scotch-Irish, when they do appear in Native American history, are usually labeled Indian killers. In fact, for a moment, I thought about calling my book Indian Killers. My publisher kind of gently took me by the elbow and said, no, let's not do that. Because that's, and you're looking at the early massacres of Native people in early America, it's usually Scots-Irish. There are either Scotch-Irish there doing the whole thing, Scots-Irish behind it, or Scotch-Irish implicated in some way. So I thought there's got to be a difference, another story to that. That's clearly a part of my story, and that's the part that J.D. Vance, who appears to be wearing a sprig of broccoli, right? Huh. Won't like, right? Because people who've written about the Scotch-Irish have generally fallen into two camps. People who depicted them as race, Indian-hating, land-hungry, murderous frontier people, or people, usually descendants of Scotch-Irish, who applaud them, who depict them as heroic figures who helped win the West. A guy by the name of James Webb, who wrote a book called Born Fighting, right? And the idea was that the Scotch-Irish were born fighting and were therefore pre-equipped for life on the frontier. And Theodore Roosevelt, in his massive work on the winning of the West, talked about the Scotch-Irish from the Appalachians to the Pacific, winning America, right? And they did it with a rifle and a family Bible, apparently. So there were these sort of stereotypes, but I didn't know of anything that really got at what the Scots-Irish were doing, particularly on the frontier, and to what extent their identity was forged in that relationship. So I taught in here, but ever since they've done that, they've got a new TV. Okay, here's the British Isles, for those of you who don't know it. Just a quick recap. Everybody who is English is British, but not everybody who is British is English, right? So I'm Scottish and English, kind of from that bit up here on the borders. But don't ever go into a pub in Dublin and accuse people of being English. That's not a good idea. The United Kingdom is Scotland, England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, right? And how Northern Ireland comes about, we'll get to in a minute. Right? For as long as anybody could remember, and I think it's still kind of that way. The area between England and Scotland was a kind of feuding borderland. It certainly still is, right? But from the Middle Ages on through Tudor times, it was an area where the rival clans raided back and forth. It was a borderland, so you got Scottish armies and English armies fighting. But a lot of the violence was not nation-on-nation violence. It was clan violence. And as far as I can figure out, all the different clans were actually raiding each other for the same cow and just sort of passing it back and forward. But that seemed to be kind of endemic. Right? When in 1603, Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, died childless. Right? The succession, through a complicated calculus, fell to James VI of Scotland. Right? So James VI of Scotland became James I of England. Right? It's called the Union of the Crown, and it pulled those two kingdoms together to some extent. Right? Although you'd never believe it if you see Scottish football fans at Wembley. Right? And James looked at that unruly borderland area and said, I don't want all that going on in the midst of my now united kingdom. And I'm also trying to do what all of my predecessors back to Norman times trying to do, and that is subjugate the Irish. Right? So his idea was take some of these people from the borderlands of England and Scotland, particularly the western lowlands of Scotland, give them incentives and transport them to Ireland, to the north of Ireland, and set them up there as this kind of colony of fighting farmers to act as a buffer between those English who were there and what they called the wild Irish. And that resulted in migrations from essentially southern Scotland to what became Ulster or Northern Ireland. Over the course of primarily the 17th century, it's estimated maybe 100,000 people went. But it resulted in the creation of a kind of series of colonies or an area of Ireland that was Protestant, right? James I was Protestant, in a sea of Catholicism, right? And we all know where that went to. Britain's been great at just sort of taking any chunk of the world and saying, hey, let's draw a line through that and move some people there and let's see how that works out. And we know how it always works out, not very well. But that's the sort of genesis. In the early 18th century, people began to leave Northern Ireland because of high rents, famine, climate, fluctuations in the linen trade, right? And landlords hiking up their rents. Right? It was no longer an attractive place to live. It was a hard place to live, and they felt increasing oppression from the Church of England, et cetera, et cetera. So they started moving, and they started migrating across the Atlantic to English colonies. This is not a great map, but take a look at the green one, the green lines. The red lines are Scotch-Irish, and the red lines are Highland Scots, right? And they're kind of my family, so they're okay, right? Look at the green ones, right? Some of the earliest ones, they're not yet usually called Scotch-Irish. Some of the earliest immigrants from Ireland arrive in Boston, where they get a chilly reception because Puritan New England thinks of them as, I don't know what they are, but they must be Catholic or something. And so those people get pushed kind of out of Boston. Some go to Worcester, Massachusetts. Some go to Maine. And then from Maine, they kind of think that's not really working out. They go back south a little bit and move into New Hampshire and settle a place that becomes Londonderry, right? Named after Londonderry in Northern Ireland, which is not only a town, but it's also a kind of symbolic place where that had been laid siege to during wars between the Catholic Irish and the Protestant Irish, which were pretty bloody. Increasingly, though, migration heads to Philadelphia, or Philadelphia and sort of Wilmington, or Newcastle, I guess, would be the other port on the estuary there. Right? And when they arrive in Philadelphia, of course, they're going to Pennsylvania, which has a reputation for religious tolerance. And they are also going in search of land. Right? But they get a similar reception in Philadelphia as they'd received in Boston, with an exception that they are encouraged when they arrive in Philadelphia not to go somewhere else, but to keep going west in Philadelphia, right? Where they can, as the provincial secretary of Pennsylvania said, serve as a buffer or a barrier against the wild Indians, just as they have served as a buffer or a barrier in Ireland against the wild Irish. Right? And that's where this idea comes that these are people who are predisposed to, they're violent themselves. What better people to have as neighbors for Indians? So that if war breaks out, they will take the brunt of this conflict and will be okay. Right? And that becomes kind of their allotted role. As they move west to, no, that's the best I've got. As they move west, of course, you run into the mountains, right? And when they hit the Alleghenies, Appalachians, they then trend southwestwards along the front of the mountains through the Shenandoah Valley, the Blue Ridge Valley, down to Virginia, down to North Carolina, down to Georgia. And they push through those mountains about the time of the American Revolution. So this is a famous picture of Daniel Boone leading settler colonists through Cumberland Gap into Kentucky. Now, Daniel Boone is not Scotch-Irish. He's descended from English Quakers. But most of those other people would have been. Right? The settlements that he lived in were primarily Scots-Irish. And the Scotch-Irish get this reputation as being the cutting edge of colonialism. Right? They trespass on Indian lands. They're armed and dangerous. They believe that their lands are there for the taking. They invoke the scriptures. They think we are in the land of Canaan. Well, if you know your scriptures, as well as I do, if you know your scriptures, you'll know that what you do with the Canaanites, the people who are there, well, you smite the heck out of them, right? You destroy them, you drive them from the land. So this becomes in many ways, their driving force. And over the course of the 18th century, absolutely, this is a lousy map, but it serves a purpose. Scotch-Irish and their descendants push down along that area, establishing settlements in all that chunk of territory. Right? These are people on the move, and they continue to be on the move. Right? So they push into Tennessee and Kentucky. From Tennessee, they push west into Missouri. From Missouri, they push south into Texas. And so you can trace the people who are Scotch-Irish or of Scotch-Irish descent all the way pretty much across the continent. And they're usually on the cutting edge of the frontier. So they're usually the first people to grate against Indian country, native communities, and to be taking native land. Well, that much I knew, or at least I thought I knew. But what I struggled with was, okay, so what else is going on? Well, first of all, the idea that they were doing this just because they were innately violent didn't seem very convincing, or just innately land hungry. What does land hunger mean? Well, the reason they were land hungry, if that's the term we use, is because they were having large families. Right? And if you have 9 sons, and you've got a family farm, you can hand off the family farm to the first one, but then you've got 8 sons who are left without. So they need to keep moving. The family needs to keep moving and replicating. And of course, this is happening at a time when native populations are declining through the influx of European diseases. The other thing that attracted my attention was the role of the violence that was attributed to them, and then kind of seemed to merge into American history. What I mean by that is, so in the French and Indian Wars, or the 7 Years' War here in America, right? The Scotch-Irish people are out on the frontier on the Appalachians. Right? The balloon goes up. Native American war parties, particularly Shawnees, Delawares, come over the mountains and beat the hell out of the Scotch-Irish, frankly. Hundreds of people are killed. Right? The idea that the Scotch-Irish could form this barrier of fighting farmers to protect people from the east never really worked. Usually, as soon as an Indian war broke out, the Scotch-Irish frontier collapsed and people fled for refuge, crowding into towns back east. And at the end of the French and Indian War, or 7 Years' War, the British government, to try and prevent it happening again, says, okay, we've got to cut this off, right? Best way to do it is try and protect Indian lands. So they issued proclamations and regulations to prevent people moving onto Indian land. Well, who is moving onto Indian land? Scotch-Irish. Right? And so Scotch-Irish people, so that, wait a minute, we fought for this in the war, and Indian people were butchering our women and children. I read dozens of petitions about this. Same kind of thing, right? Same kind of language over and over again. And now our government, whether in London or in Philadelphia, is turning its back on us. And instead of protecting us and defending us against Indians and rewarding us by giving us Indian land and getting rid of Indian people, it's coddling up to the Indians. And in December of 1763, Scotch-Irish frontiersmen from Paxton, Pennsylvania, first of all murdered half a dozen Conestoga Indian people close to Paxton. And then they went to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where 14 more Conestogas and those 20 people represented the sole survivors of the Conestoga Indian people who were descendants of the Susquehanna, and murdered them. And they didn't just murder them, they butchered and mutilated them. And that event is often taken by historians of colonial Pennsylvania as a moment, a dark moment, because Pennsylvania, of course, was William Penn's peaceable kingdom, where he got along well with native people by ostensibly dealing with them fairly and justly in getting their land. And now here, there's bloodshed and murder. Right? And nobody who ever brought to justice. Right? Nobody knew who these people were, said their minister, who said that he tried to talk them out of this. Right? Presumably behind a screen. Right? We know the names of every native person who was murdered, and we don't know the names of any of the people who perpetuated the murdering. Fast forward 19 years. At the end of the American Revolution, in Western Pennsylvania, or in Ohio actually, in a massacre perpetrated by the Westmoreland militia of Pennsylvania. The militia marched to a village that was called Gnadenhutten. It means tents of grace. And it was a mission village established by the Moravians and populated by Delaware Indian people who'd converted to the Moravian faith, which meant they were pacifists. They were trying to sit out the war, which is never a good idea in those kind of circumstances. The Pennsylvania militia rounded them up, divided them into men, women, and children, voted about their fate, whether they should be burned to death or just executed, and then systematically bludgeoned the 96 men, women, and children to death using butcher's mallets, right? While the Delaware victims knelt and prayed. Right? In the aftermath of that massacre, the commander at Fort Pitt, a guy by the name of William Irvin, who was also from Northern Ireland, wrote to his wife and said, don't say anything don't express any opinions on this, because if you do, people may take your opinion as being my opinion, and I have no opinions on this. Right? Obviously, this was an environment that was toxic. Right? And whereas we don't know the names of the people who perpetrated the massacre at Paxton, we know the names of the people who perpetrated the massacre at Gnadenhutten. In fact, they almost reveled in it. So there's a change here. And there's a change in the attitudes on the frontier. And partly that's a product of escalating warfare. And partly it's the fault of Thomas Jefferson, who in the Declaration of Independence said, the king has unleashed on our frontiers savage Indian warriors whose known mode of warfare is the indiscriminate slaughter of men, women, and children, i.e. Indians at the moment of the nation's birth, had chosen the wrong side and committed mayhem on the frontier. Right? Well, among Jefferson's self-evident truths, that was a half-truth at best. Right? But what it did was establish Native Americans in the minds of Americans as enemies of the new nation, enemies of the Republic. And that basically sets up a dynamic where killing Indians is a different deal. Right? In 1763, when the Paxton Massacre was carried out, people were horrified. 20 native people, they were Christians, they were neighboring people. People knew them, they traded and lived among the settlers, were murdered, and people held up their hands in horror. In 1782, the general response was these people had it coming because they were Indians. Right? And killing Indians was now more of a patriotic duty. Right? So the Scotch-Irish who perpetrated both massacres go from being these ruthless killers to fighting for the cause, patriotic Americans. Fast forward another 80 years. General Philip Sheridan, right, was the commander of Indian wars against Plains Indians in particular, is credited with the saying, "The only good Indian is a dead Indian." Sheridan was from County Cavan, Northern Ireland. Nobody even made a connection there. That was not of any significance or relevance. And perhaps it isn't to anybody but me. But that attitude and that racial motivation in dealing with Indian people has now become ingrained in American attitudes towards all Native Americans, ingrained in American Indian policy. And one of the people responsible for that was Andrew Jackson, who was the son of Scotch-Irish immigrants from North Carolina, who later moved to Tennessee, who came to the presidency on a mandate for the removal of Indian people, the settler colonial program, right? You have to get rid of Indian people. You can either kill them, and Jackson did plenty of that, or you can deport them, which he did through the Indian Removal Act. So in wrestling with this book, I was always struggling with, okay, to what extent is this the Scotch-Irish doing this, and to what extent is this just the normal stuff that people do to each other because people do terrible things to each other. Right? But there is a fairly clear progression by which what the Scotch-Irish do to native people becomes what Americans do to native people. And then in the 19th century, it all gets a real boost because of the massive influx into the United States, not of people from the north of Ireland, but of people from the rest of Ireland in the after the Irish potato famine, right? Where thousands and thousands of Catholic Irish are flooding into America, right? Into American cities. And as we know, the most recent immigrants are always the least popular, right? There's hostility to them. And so people who are descended from these original Scotch-Irish say, we've got to distance ourselves, right? Our identity and our place in this society may have been a little unclear. We've got to make it clear. What have we got to make clear? That we're not Catholic Irish. We're Scotch-Irish. And Scotch-Irish have this heroic tradition of fighting to win the West for America and moving the American frontier forward. So this history is sort of layered over and clouded with these myths. And that's what that Irish Independent newspaper was talking about. That's the J.D. Vance view of his ancestors. But there's another dimension to this as well. When the Paxton boys, as they'd said, isn't it interesting now they also attach that word boys to people who are a bunch of thugs, right? Some things don't change, right? The proud Paxton boys, let's put it that way, didn't just kill native people. When they'd finished slaughtering the Conestogas in Paxton and Lancaster, they then, with about a couple of hundred other people, gathered their forces and marched on Philadelphia, announcing that they were going to kill all of the native people who'd taken refuge there and the Quakers. Well, the Quakers dominated the Pennsylvania Assembly. And of course, as Quakers, they had not funded defense. They weren't going to commit colony money to a war effort. So from the views of the Scotch-Irish, here was the Quakers who were running the government, who had left them defenseless to be slaughtered by Indian people. And now the Quakers were giving refuge and sanctuary to Indians. Right? So not for the first time, not for the last time in American history, people who feel themselves distant from the centers of power and privilege lash out in frustration against people of color and the government. Right? You could see maybe how this might be kind of difficult for me to be writing this book while, January 6th is happening on the TV. Right? But this becomes part of the relationship. It's a triangulated relationship in which time and time again when Scots-Irish people trespass on Indian land, kill Indian people, it is connected to their relations with the government as well. Because governments, whether in Britain or Washington or the various states, try and keep people off native land, but they try and regulate the frontier to make sure things go ahead smoothly. Right? Well, the Scotch-Irish mess all that up. But in another way, you can look at it and say, but, and I suppose a cynical view, I don't think it's cynical because I can see it. Those governments send these Scotch-Irish people out to the frontier with the deliberate intention that they're going to mess everything up. They're going to destabilize the frontier. They're going to trespass on native lands. They're going to, in many ways, generate conflict so that then the colonial power has no choice but to send in the troops, suppress the rebellion, negotiate a treaty which requires Indian people to give up land, and then the process starts again. Right? And that's just not me making it up. That's Thomas Jefferson saying this is how it's going to work. So when the Scotch-Irish forged their identity in North America, because I don't think Scotch-Irish as a term is something that really develops in the 19th century, although it's used occasionally in the 18th century. One of the first mentions is, it caught my attention because a guy by the name of Thomas Creasap used it. And he caught my attention because he came from the next town where I grew up. He came from Skipton in Yorkshire, and he had that same characteristic tact and diplomacy. He referred to a bunch of officers of the law who were coming to arrest him as a posse of damned Scotch-Irish sons of bitches, right? So the name was in circulation, right? But it becomes particularly used in the 19th century as a way of distancing people who had been here before the influx of Catholic immigrants. Right? And that identity is forged in America, and I think it's forged on the frontier. It's forged partly fighting against, i.e. killing Indian people, but it's also forged in relationship to Eastern governments and Eastern elites, whom the Scotch-Irish people on the frontier regard as almost equally their enemies. And I think when you get to that point, we can see a lot of parallels between then and now. Right? I fought against sort of saying, yeah, well, this is Trump's base that I'm looking at. Right? There are a lot of similar attitudes and a lot of similar actions. But that relationship, right, and the getting a handle on what makes people do that. Right? It's not enough to just say these people are Indian haters or land hungry or rednecks. There's something else going on there. And I think it lies in that relationship between people who are out there who've been promised something, right, and who are desperate to get land that has native people on it, are convinced that that land is their land, and look to their governments to aid and abet them in removing native people who are in the way, and those governments seem to do the opposite. And that, if you look at American history, in the long term, there's so much of those tensions, right? And controlling the frontier was something that the British failed to do, and it helped produce the American Revolution. But it's something, of course, that Washington always struggled to do. So this is a very sort of, I've sort of distilled this down to you as if I sort of, worked my way through all of these records and said, oh yeah, here it is. It was more like I was drowning in this stuff. What the hell's going on? Right? Because another difficulty is, who are these people anyway? How do you know a Scots-Irish person when you see one? Right? A name is not enough, because lots of people change their name when they get from Scotland to Ireland, and then change it again when they get from Ireland to North America. They don't live in communities that are exclusively Scots-Irish. Lots of other people live with them. So I'm trying to figure out who the people are and which neighborhoods are predominantly Scots-Irish. But I could see that native people knew. Native people, Delawares in particular in the Susquehanna Valley, knew where the hot spots were. They said, the English, and I mean the English, we're not going to come to Philadelphia that way because we don't want to have to go by the Irish settlements. Right? And by then, at that time in the 18th century, when they say Irish, they don't mean Catholic Irish, they mean Scotch-Irish. So for me, it's an important topic because it complicates the frontier, which is kind of what I'm all about. My students will tell you if I'll end a class and say, if that all seems complicated and unclear and messy to you, that's the way it's supposed to be, right? And then they think they've had a good lesson, right? Yeah. But it is. And part of the difficulty of doing American history is we have to peel back these simple stories about how the West was won, right? And the Scotch-Irish are very often credited with that role, along with Colt 45s and Winchester repeaters, right? Well, won from whom, right? What does that mean? It means killing the people who are living there. Is this now become an American value? The Scotch-Irish certainly thought that it had. And so they publicly, they and their descendants, subscribed to that notion and said, yeah, we did that. So it's not just about violent immigrants. This is a lot, I think, about America and America's sense of itself, as well as people who are struggling for an identity. That's probably enough, right? I could say, read on, but didn't give you your books, so. So I've got.
Questions for Professor Calloway?
Yeah.
You mentioned the conception of Native peoples as individually as peoples in the Declaration of Independence, but also in the Constitution, the Commerce Clause refers to them as sovereign entities. To what degree do you think the Scotch-Irish settlers conceived of their actions, I guess, against Native peoples as going against them as individual people, or as governments or political groups in a similar way that they could go against political groups that were
That's a good question. I think you maybe put a finer distinction on it than Scotch-Irish do. Right? Because one of the things that happens, of course, is that the country, America, and the people who are pushing west simply lump all native people together. And so in the wars, people will talk about the aggressive Indian nations, right? But a lot of the people who are killed and murdered are individual Indians, right? And they know them. And I think that's an interesting dynamic. I mean, that's a bad way to put it. Oh, it's not interesting. But a lot of times what happens is people get murdered where you have Scotch-Irish people on the frontier murder an Indian person after drinking with them in a tavern, right? And it's somebody they know. Right? Well, is that Indian hating? Is that race-based? I mean, what's going on there? So I think the government, very often who are making the treaties, is looking at native people as nations, sovereign nations with whom you make a treaty. In many ways, the peoples on the frontier, and the Scotch-Irish being part of that, don't, because there's not that acknowledgement. Because if you recognize native people there as having their own sovereignty, that kind of recognizes their nationhood and their right to be there. And their argument is these people have no right to be there because we have a God-given right to be there. And these people are in the way. And does that get at your question? I know it doesn't answer it, but what the heck, I'm a Dartmouth professor.
This is kind of an awkward and kind of a doubly horrendous question, but I have always wondered why. Well, you're dealing with dark things.
Yeah.
Why there was not more interest, support, and push toward the enslavement of Native Americans rather than the importation of African slaves or slaves from outside. That is, there does seem to be a kind of big line of distinction, and I was wondering whether it was kind of religious or quasi-religious, or how would you frame that?
Yeah, and of course that's incredibly complicated. So some native people hold slaves, pre-contact, and then after contact, some native people like Cherokees take on slavery, but it's still not with the, it's still not the same as sort of plantation slavery where, the children inherit the slave status of their parents and all of that. But in terms of the Scotch-Irish, first of all, most of them would not hold slaves because they couldn't afford it. Most of these people are poor. And what they want usually is land for themselves. And if they did have a slave, it would be, maybe one enslaved person working with them. However, if we put this in the larger forces of kind of Atlantic capitalism, right? When Andrew Jackson goes to war against the Creeks, which kind of any way you look at that war in 1813-14, it's a genocidal war. I mean, Jackson is telling his wife, we're going to commit genocide. Right? He says, after the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, he says, it was dark before we finished killing them. Right? And at the end of that war, he dictates a treaty at the Treaty of Fort Jackson, which takes like 23 million it's the biggest cession of Indian land. Right? Now, the argument he was using was this would be land for people like Scotch-Irish followers. Many of the people who fought in this Creek War with Jackson was of Scotch-Irish descent. Samuel Houston, Davy Crockett, these guys are all Scotch-Irish. But the land that he takes is the rich land down here, right? Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, right? Not so much up in Tennessee. No. Why does he want that land? He wants that land for cotton plantation agriculture, right? And for that to spread across the South, you need to get rid of the native people who are there. Right? So you kick the native people out, dictate treaties that require them to move, and then later federal government mandates that in the Indian Removal Act. You kick Indian people out, you move in not so much Scotch-Irish individual farmers, but plantation slavery, which grows cotton after Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin in 1793, can do that. And then the whole thing's booming, right? Because that cotton goes from the south up to Manchester, New Hampshire, Manchester, England, where they weave the cotton. And some of that cotton comes back to clothe the slaves who are producing the cotton on the lands that have been taken from Indian people. And again, what happens, and this is why Andrew Jackson is such a hypocrite, is that who benefits out of that? It's not just white people who benefit. It's well-to-do white people like Andrew Jackson who benefit at the expense of Native Americans, African Americans, and poor whites, who include the Scotch-Irish. So I have in my book a quotation from Walter Abernathy, who was a Tennessee historian of over 100 years ago, who says, Andrew Jackson portrayed himself as a champion of the people. He wasn't. All he did was get people to champion him. Words to that effect. And then I said something like, no wonder Donald Trump had a picture of Andrew Jackson on his White House desk. Left my objective stance, but I think that's the other short answer is that time and time again, when people try and use native people as slaves, they prove to be not good slaves, but they're used everywhere. The native people are enslaved in New England, all down the East Coast. Native people are enslaved in the Southwest, in Mexico, in the silver mines, and that kind of thing. But lots of times when native people are taken and sold into slavery, they're shipped out of Boston or shipped out of Charleston to the Caribbean to work in sugar plantations, which of course means that they're consigned to a short life. Right? And in their place, enslaved African people moved in.
I had a question. Earlier in the talk, you had mentioned court records that revealed the dissatisfaction of the Scottish-Irish people and how they had been treated on the frontier. And you've mentioned them moving, and I'm wondering, what were your primary sources for the Scotch-Irish sentiment at that time? Were there broadsides? Did they have newspapers? How did you find that research?
Yeah, most of it's in Philadelphia. And when I started out the book, I had plans to just go and camp out in Philadelphia for a long time at the Pennsylvania Historical Society and the American Philosophical Society. And then, of course, COVID happened. So I found a kind of staff researcher who you can actually buy a lot of photocopies for the cost of hotel bills. And just going through and sending me stuff. So there's lots, and a lot of this stuff is also in the Pennsylvania archives, which is printed. I think the total of that, we've got them sitting in Baker Library. I think there's a total of 138 volumes. And they're not all packed, but some of them are solid with the kind of records I need. So there's correspondence, sometimes by people who are well, just say that are Scotch-Irish themselves, and they're talking about their constituents. Sometimes there are lots of these petitions in time of war. Newspapers, lots of those kinds of things. Lots of commentaries by government officials about people who they don't necessarily call them Scots-Irish, but you know from whom they're talking about that they are. Right? So people like George Washington and Henry Knox, who are trying to implement a policy of, if you like, restraint on the frontier, complain endlessly that the people who are living on the frontier, i.e. the Scotch-Irish, won't let it work because they ignore the laws, they go and kill Indians. And of course, that's where you get in. Yeah, but on the one hand, they're doing the dirty work of American expansion. So the difficulty was not finding the quantity of sources. There was lots of them. The difficulty is mining those sources to say, okay, is this particularly about Scots-Irish people? And in some of those petitions, you can tell enough by the names that this is clearly a Scotch-Irish neighbourhood that it's coming from. And then you get to know some of these characters that crop up again and again. You know, names like, and they're names that wouldn't necessarily attribute to being Irish or even Scottish names like Armstrong, right? Or Graham. My son's name is Graham Lindsay. And when he was born, I don't know why we chose that name. Perhaps it was just because we were living in, he has to live in America. It's going to have a British name. But somebody that I was working with said, he's going to get into a lot of fights with a name like that because they're both border clans, right? And some of those clans, they're not just raiding other clans. They're raiding their own clan on other sides of the border, things like that. But lots and lots of sources in Pennsylvania, and that's really the core of it. And then the trail becomes thinner the further west people go. And that is partly because they become, I think, these communities become less distinct. But I'm also, in doing that, in writing the book, I'm tracking the native people that the Scots-Irish displaced. So Scots-Irish people who turn up in Texas, right, turn up in Texas alongside Delaware people who've been displaced from Pennsylvania, gone to Ohio, then Indiana, and then Missouri and Texas. And they're meeting, you know, they're meeting Scotch-Irish people who did that kind of same thing. And in New Mexico and Arizona in the 1870s, there's a guy called James Kirker, who's a very unpleasant character, who makes a living, makes a career as a bounty hunter, on collecting bounties on Apache scalps. His right-hand man, as it were, in his gang is a guy called Skybook. And Skybook is a Shawnee. And the Shawnees have likewise moved kind of west. So instead of this sort of idea that we often have, that there's an Indian white frontier that moves steadily, it's a much more messy situation in which native people are moving into native lands and being pushed by people, and then they often meet people they've met before, you know, hundreds of miles further west, which you didn't ask about at all, but you know, I get jazzed on this stuff, as you can see.
Maybe one last question?
Hi.
Hi. I was wondering what your thoughts were on the idea of like the culture of horror theory about why Appalachia is so kind of prone to violence, because it's not agriculture that's sustaining them, but livestock, and that can get stolen overnight. And so creating like this cult, or like just this strength of personality around your family, to as people who are like strong and will fight, will impact how you're perceived and how well off you are, because people won't steal from you. So I'm wondering how much you think that kind of culture of honor is playing into this situation with the Scotch-Irish versus like their kind of past and their history coming from England.
Yeah. Or not from England, right?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's a very good question. Of course, that would be the J.D. Vance interpretation and the James Webb interpretation. And I'd first of all sort of regard that as very skeptical, because one thing I didn't want was my view of the Scotch-Irish to be essentialist, right? These people are Scotch-Irish, so they all have this characteristic. However, I do know that that's ingrained in those borderland societies between Scotland and England at the time, as well as in Ireland. And that was part of the thinking. And when Scots-Irish people talk about their memories of the Revolution, for instance, or the French and Indian War, that's what they talk about. Right? Memory, or children who grew up talk about being at night in the family cabin in the farm, listening for noises and signs of a native attack, and that the fathers and the brothers were ready to defend the family. And so I don't necessarily buy into it, but I take it very seriously, because I think it is a very significant part of the characteristics and behavior, I guess, that the people who identify as Scotch-Irish, or come to identify as Scotch-Irish, refer to. And I think that's actually maybe it might be a stereotype, but it might be a more useful stereotype than just, well, they're Indian haters, they're Indian killers, right? Because, of course, what happens is once people kill families, then it becomes, the cycle just keeps going, right? Yeah.
Thanks very much, Colin Calloway. We've run out of time.
Thank you.